Welcome to the 1 o'clock reading with two just simply remarkable writers of fiction. Clearly, I'm not the only one who feels this way, seeing all of you in the room. My name is Elizabeth Catlin, and I am part of this festival organizing committee and also on the author committee, which is very fun. This year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, Brattleboro Community Television, the Stepansky Family Trust, the Vermont Humanities Council, and poets and writers. We would also like to thank our advertisers, and you'll see them in the program. We encourage you to support them while you're here or if you live here. The festival is run entirely by volunteers, but it has very real expenses, so we encourage you to make a donation. There's a donation box in the back. There's some cards with our QR code that lead to our website. Please give often, give generously. And if you can just make sure that the ringer on your cell phone is off at this time, but please feel free to take photos and share them with us on social media. We have a special sponsor for this event. It is sponsored by the MWKABG, a mysterious acronym for a very highly esteemed book group. So without further ado, I am going to introduce the first of these two authors, Sigrid Nunez. She has published 9 novels, including The Friend, which won the 2018 National Book Award and was recently listed among the 100 best books of the 21st century by the New York Times. Maybe you were in this room when Sigrid read in 2018. I remember the house being just as packed as it is today, and we are so lucky to have her back with her newest novel, The Vulnerables. Sigrid Nunez was born, raised, and continues to live in New York City, where she received her BA from Barnard College and her MFA from Columbia University. She has taught at Columbia, Princeton, BU, and the New School, and has been a visiting writer or writer in residence at Amherst, Smith, Baruch, Vassar, Syracuse, and the University of California, Irvine, among others. Nunez has also been on the faculty of the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, which we always like to mention the local Vermont connection. So 2 of her novels have been made into films released this year, The Friend, starring Naomi Watts, and What Are You Going Through, which was adapted by Pedro Almodovar into his English feature debut, The Room Next Door, which is coming, it's probably released in New York, but not up here. It stars Tilda Swinton and Julianne Moore. And that film was recently awarded the Golden Lion at the 81st Venice International Film Festival. So this is the quote that sums up for me how I feel about Sigrid's books, and I imagine for many of you as well. Quote, I am committed until one of us dies to Nunez novels. I find them ideal. They are short, wise, provocative, funny, good and strong company. That's Dwight Garner from the New York Times. So please help me welcome Sigrid to the podium.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank all of you for being here. Yes, I was here in 2018, and I had published The Friend. And first, I just want to say how that book began, how I started writing that book. I was teaching in the MFA program at Boston University at the time, and every spring they have a faculty reading. And since they have a number of faculty, they don't want you to read too long, about 8 minutes, they say. So I wanted to read something new, and I decided I would just start writing something. I would write 8 minutes of something. And so I started, that it didn't have to be complete. So I started writing what became the first pages of The Friend. I liked the response I got at that reading. And then shortly after that, I was asked to read at the University of Maryland and they wanted 25 minutes. So I continued to that. And by that time, I thought, I think this could be a book. And there is the important character in that book. One of the most important characters is the Great Dane Apollo. And people think that I had this idea to write this book about the Great Dane. But in fact, I didn't. I just, as I say, I was just writing to fill in minutes. And but then at a certain point, I had a character, it begins with a memorial service. The narrator's friend and mentor has taken his own life. And when she's at this service, I have his third wife, his widow, says to the narrator, would you come? I need to talk to you about something important. So I was at that point in the book, and then I said to myself, so what could that be? And now I have to, and that's, that's what fiction is, right? It's like, it answers the question, what if? And at that point I thought, I could put a dog in the novel, and I could make it a great big dog. And then I went on with the story, and the dog became, one of the main characters. And that movie has not actually been released. It's been making the film festivals. The dog's name is Bing, the actor, the real dog. He's this 150-pound Harlequin Dane, and he does a wonderful job. Naomi Watts is good too. Bill Murray is also in it, and he's good. But we all agree, the star is Bing. Okay, so then I wrote another novel. So when that book was finished, I started writing the next novel, What Are You Going Through? That's the film that Almodovar has been made into a film by Almodovar. He's called The Room Next Door. And there, I had started writing it. I was, just not that far into it when I realized that in many ways it was a continuation of The Friend. It's not a true sequel, but the narrators were very similar. They had very similar sensibility. They had similar lives. In both cases, it was a woman, and also identified with myself, this narrator. A woman around my age who is a New Yorker, lives in Manhattan, lives alone, and is a writer, and teaches writing and literature. So in that book, I at a certain point, it just came to me. I have the narrator is at a B&B, and I have an Airbnb, excuse me, and I have the host has a new cat, and the cat jumps on the bed. And I just decided to write a very small chapter from a story of this. The cat tells the story of his life. And when I then went on with the book, I thought, well, that could maybe be really silly. If the editor says, we got to get rid of the cat, it would be no problem, because nothing before that chapter or nothing after that chapter, the cat never appears again. The cat is not essential to the story. So the editor reads it. The first thing she says is, I love the cat. And then many people who read it also like the cat a lot. And the thing is that it struck me because that part takes up so few pages in the book, and nevertheless, a lot of people will say, oh, the cat, that's the book about the cat. That's got the cat in it. So when I started writing The Vulnerables, again, the narrator, it was the same narrator, and I also thought, okay, I thought this is also coming out of the other two novels. That's when I realized that I had an unofficial trilogy. I never planned to make these books a trilogy, but so at that point I thought, because of the way people had responded to the animals in the first two books of this unofficial trilogy, that I would definitely put an animal in this book too, The Vulnerables. And I chose a parrot. The parrot has an extremely small role, really, but I was not surprised to find a headline in the UK that was "The Book About the Parrot." And what this tells me is that people would really enjoy seeing more animals as characters in fiction. And of course, each book cover, there's a dog on the cover of The Friend and a cat on the cover of What Are You Going Through, and there is the part of a parrot on the cover of this. Okay, so it was time to. All right, it was the time of the pandemic and the lockdown, and I was not at work on a new book. But like everybody else, I was paralyzed. I didn't know what I was going to do. Was I going to write again? Was the world going to end? Were we all going to die? I mean, I know you remember it very well. But it was time for the BU MFA faculty reading. It was spring. And I thought, I will write, 8 minutes. It worked before, and it worked again. So I immediately thinking, okay, I'll just start writing something. The sentence came to me, it was an uncertain spring. As you may recall, it really was. However, that is the first line of Virginia Woolf's novel, The Years. And I thought, isn't it? And I looked it up, and it was. And so, I felt like saying, if you think that was an uncertain spring. Okay, so I just want to read the beginning of this because, and as I said, I just started writing. I didn't know what I wanted to write or what kind of book I might want to write for my next book, but the only thing that I felt I could write about was what was happening right then in this uncertain spring of 2020. So, so it really, that's really how this began. It was an uncertain spring. I had read the book a long time ago, and except for this sentence, I remembered almost nothing about it. I could not have told you about the people who appeared in the book or what happened to them. I could not have told you until later, after I'd looked it up, that the book began in the year 1880. Not that it mattered. Only when I was young did I believe that it was important to remember what happened in every novel I read. Now I know the truth. What matters is what you experience while reading, the states of feeling that the story evokes, the questions that rise to your mind rather than the fictional events described. They should teach you this in school, but they don't. Always, instead, the emphasis is on what you remembered. Otherwise, how could you write a critique? How could you pass an exam? How could you ever get a degree in literature? I like the novelist who confessed that the only thing to have stayed with him after reading Anna Karenina was the detail of a picnic basket holding a jar of honey. What stayed with me all this time after reading The Years was how it opened with that first sentence followed by a description of the weather. Never open a book with the weather is one of the first rules of writing. I have never understood why not. Implacable November weather is the third sentence of Bleak House, after which Dickens famously goes on a lot about fog. It was a dark and stormy night. I have never understood why this phrase has been universally acknowledged to be the worst way for, I forget who, something else to look up, to begin a novel, scorned for being both unexciting and at the same time too melodramatic. Edward Bulwer Lytton, originally, in a book called Paul Clifford in 1830. Others thereafter in mockery, most memorably Ray Bradbury, Madeleine L'Engle, and Snoopy. Unimaginative was the word Oscar Wilde used to describe people for whom weather is a topic of conversation. Of course, in his day, weather, English weather in particular, was boring. Not the far more erratic, often apocalyptic event people all over the world obsess about today. Important to point out, however, that it wasn't normal fog, condensed vapor, a low cloud that Dickens was talking about, but a miasma caused by London's appalling industrial pollution. It was an uncertain spring. Early each morning I went for a walk. It was my chief pleasure, in a dearth of pleasures, observing day by day the arrival of a new season, the magnolias putting out their petals, and so poignantly soon as it seemed to me every year, but never more so than the spring of 2020, shedding their petals. The cherry blossoms, even loveliest, agreed, but likewise short-lived. The daffodils and the narcissi, and the gaudy tulips that seemed almost like wild mouths screaming for attention. Too excitable is how Sylvia Plath once saw a vase of too red ones, like Rilke's frightened flowers rising up to say red. To Elizabeth Bishop, the spots on the tips of the dogwood petals were like burns from a cigarette butt. Poets. Okay, so that is how the book begins, and indeed, that's what I was doing, walking around. And at one point, I noticed that it occurred to me in real life to think how flowers, which are beautiful things, almost all have beautiful names. You know, rose, lily, iris, azalea, anemone, etc. And that I'm asking the air, the reader, whoever. I can't really think of a single flower name that's ugly. Okay, so then again with this novel, it was the same process as the other two and just about everything I've written, where they're hybrids. I have a first-person narrator who is a writer, as I say, who I'm very identified with. The author is very identified with. Who and in the cases where that narrator is observing things, reflecting on things like flower names or whatever I just read, you know, those are my thoughts and my observations. So you could say they are not nonfiction. But then it's like I am incapable of starting to write anything for any length of time without beginning to lie. It's like immediately, I mean, because that's why I became a writer, because I wanted to make things up, because I wanted to use my imagination. So immediately, after a very short time, I start thinking, what if? What would happen if? And then I just start making things up. And then as I continue to string along these lies, I have to, justify them. I have to create a story. So there's always a completely fictional narrative in addition to what these sort of essayistic parts where, as I say, the narrator is giving certain opinions and, reflections. Okay, so I just want to read one more thing. The book is, The Vulnerables is divided into two parts, and there's a short section in between the two parts, which I call an interlude. And that's what I'm reading now. I like the way Rousseau declares in the first sentence of his autobiography that he is about to do something that has never been done before and that will never be done again. The problem with any first sentence, said Joan Didion, is that you're stuck with it. Everything else is going to flow out of that sentence. And by the time you've laid down the first two sentences, your options are all gone. Before beginning, too many options. Then in the next breath, none. When you can't sleep goes an old cure for insomnia. Start telling yourself the story of your life. For some reason, writer's block has always felt to me like a kind of insomnia. I like that Norman Mailer said, There's a touch of writer's block in a writer's work every day. I don't remember who said, insomnia is the inability to forget. When you're having trouble writing, get up, go out, take a walk in the street. You will discover that certain streets exist precisely for this purpose. Once I saw a man, homeless by the look of him, digging through the trash. He pulled out a couple of sheets of newspaper, examined them, and threw them back. Fishing deeper, he hauled up a magazine, squinted at the cover, and threw it back. Shit, he said, walking away, there ain't nothing to read in these fucking cans anymore. Rousseau goes on to say that he has embellished the story of his life only to fill a void when his memory failed. But of course, he never gives you the heads up. Never write, I don't remember, editor says. It undermines your authority. But write as if you remember everything, and reader will smell a rat. I like the student in my graduate fiction writing class who said, I've read your novels and there's one thing I have to ask. Do you make some of that stuff up? I like that Allen Ginsberg told a teenager who wanted to know what he should write about, that he should write about his love for his friends. I once made the mistake of writing about a love too soon after it was over, forgetting Chekhov's advice that you should sit down to write only when you feel as cold as ice. How can a man who knows nothing about love be a great novelist? A character in a novel by J.M. Coetzee says about a character named John Coetzee. I like that Virginia Woolf said, everything I read these days, including my own work, seems to me too long. That Borges said, unlike the novel, a short story may be, for all purposes, essential. But not that Jeanette Winterson said, I think long books are rude. Not that Céline said, novels are something like lace, an art that went out with the convent. More and more, I like the idea of a pen name. Sugared nouns was the computer suggestion after spell checking my name. Some writers use pen names so that they can be more truthful, others so that they can tell more lies. I like how Lily Tomlin used to introduce one part of her act. The following skit is about my parents. I have changed their names to protect their identities. You can start with fiction or start with documentary, according to Jean-Luc Godard. Either way, you will inevitably find the other. I like the sliver of ice in the heart that Graham Greene thought every writer must have. I have it. And the grain of stupidity, Flannery O'Connor said, the writer of fiction can't do without. I have that too. I like that Alan Bennett said, for a writer, nothing is ever quite as bad as it is for other people because, however dreadful, it may be of use. Oncologist says, that doesn't sound like any writer I know. I like John Banville's paraphrase of Bennett. Writers don't suffer as much as other people. An enormous stroke of luck is how Garcia Marquez described his cancer diagnosis, for it goaded him to start writing his autobiography. There is always a sheet of paper, there is always a pen, there is always a way out, wrote H.L. Mencken, who nevertheless hoped that his life would not last too long. Write, paper, pencil are said to have been the dying words of the poet Heine, unless they were, of course God will forgive me, that's his job, as has also been reported. I like that at the end of his life, Darwin said he wished that he had read more poetry, that Keynes said he wished that he had drunk more champagne. That Chekhov said, "It's a long time since I drank champagne," then drained his glass and died. I like last words, Beethoven. "I shall hear in heaven." Käthe Kollwitz. Good luck, everyone. "Bring me a ladder, quickly a ladder," Gogol. And nutty epitaphs. "I know not everyone is unhappy about this." I wanted to write a comic novel, then realized I had my own life to hand. Sugared nouns, my life and death as a writer. Once you start on the road to autobiography, fretted Calvino, where do you stop? I can tell the story of my life in just 4 words. Good times, bad times. There will always be lace makers. There will always be convents. But about you, my love, I will never feel as cold as ice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Roxana Robinson. Roxana Robinson is the author of 11 books, 7 novels, 3 collections of short stories, and a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. Her fiction has also appeared in numerous publications and has been widely anthologized as well as awarded. We have been lucky to have her at 2 prior literary festivals here in Brattleboro and are thrilled to have her back to talk about her latest novel, Leaving. Roxana was raised in Pennsylvania and received a BA degree in English literature from the University of Michigan. She worked in the American painting department at Sotheby's and wrote about American art until she began to publish short fiction in the 1980s. Robinson has taught at Wesleyan University, the University of Houston, and at the New School. Since 1997, she has been taught at the Wesleyan Writers Conference and is currently teaching in the Hunter College MFA program. Meg Wolitzer describes Leaving, Robinson's newest novel, as, quote, powered by Roxana Robinson's deep understanding of ambiguities, allegiances, and the lengths people must sometimes go to navigate them, end quote. To me, this description captures Roxana's unique genius on the pages of all of her books. Please help me welcome Roxana Robinson.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you all for being here. Brattleboro is such a wonderful literary festival. This is my 3rd time. I will come back every time I'm invited. It's such a warm, sympathetic, book-friendly place. I love being here. And I love reading with Sigrid, who's a writer whose work that I admire, and I had a response to almost everything she was saying. Doesn't Moby Dick start out with "It was a dark November in my soul"? Joan Didion's absolutely right about the...
It's not on?
Is it not on?
Get it a little closer to you.
I'm not doing anything
You're
different.
taller.
Yeah, I'm taller.
Get it closer to you.
Can you raise it a little bit? Yeah, it's right there.
This. This is not the part that I'm good at, so or just if you want to just can you hold it or no? You'd rather not, 'cause you
Well,
can't hold the book.
while I'm reading, it's
Okay.
it's
Can you
okay.
just move back a little bit?
Yeah, that's when
And then maybe I'll put it up here. Sorry, we're adapting. We're adapting. And then
How about that? Is that better? Okay. So, thank you all for being here. The Joan Didion book, a response to the first sentence, made me laugh. Every single novel I've read, I could recite the first sentence of it, and it never changes. That's the opening. That's the portal into that world. So it's fun to hear all these writers describe it. So this book, when I write a novel, I write about something that I find, the idea emerges first. It's something that I find confusing or troubling. It's a set of circumstances, but there's this this troubling, this knot of complexity that I need to worry at. I won't say explore and untangle because I'm never sure that I can untangle it. I just need to go into it. And then characters emerge, and then they write the book, basically. They write the narrative. And the things that have troubled me are sometimes intimate family affairs. My book, This Is My Daughter, is about a blended family. I was really interested in the 90s about the American idea that you could always move on, you could move west, you could get a new job, you could get a new wife, you could get new kids, and you just keep reinventing yourself. But in my experience, that was not the case, that you could not make a new family. You could not put a new family together with the shards of an old family. That was very difficult. So I wrote about that. Sweetwater was really about sort of the environment and the way that was 2003 that I was seeing this landslide happening. Even though we knew about climate change, it didn't seem as though we were ever going to do anything about it. And I wrote about what it's like to be part of that reckoning. Sparta was about what it's like to be a country at war and what it's like to come home from war. That's something that our country doesn't do no country does it well. Nobody knows what to do with the warrior who has to come back and become a civilian again. So this book, and then Dawson's Fall, my previous book, was about my great-grandparents who lived in Charleston, South Carolina after the Civil War. And my great-grandfather was an Englishman who came to this country to fight on the wrong side of the Civil War. And on my other side, that's my father's grandfather. On my mother's side, Harriet Beecher Stowe is my great-great-great-aunt. So I had always thought I was never going to touch that subject of slavery, because she had done it in a really big way. And I didn't want to try to hang on her coattails. But then when I learned more about my great-grandparents who were in the South, and I started thinking about this whole country, which had become complicit in a crime, I wanted to figure out how that could happen to people who were decent in other ways. How could that be part of your character? So that was the problem I was dealing with then. And with this book, I was curious about how people connect at a certain moment in their life. And we have all read a million versions of Romeo and Juliet. We know what it's like to see lovers in their late teens or early 20s and connect. We have all read Updike and Cheever. We know what happens in midlife. We know about the crisis. We know about the adultery. We know about the kids who are tugged back and forth. But we haven't really read what happens to people when they're 60, say, when they're completely healthy, they're vital, they're not on walkers, they're playing tennis, they have grown children or children who are adult, and they are in a different state in their lives. And so when you're 20 and you connect with somebody, the two of you can move to China. You have no obligations, or you finish college or whatever. You can go wherever you want. Nobody's depending on you. You can pick up jobs wherever you go. You're free, basically, emotionally and psychologically. Everyone expects you to rush around and do stuff. But when you're 60, you are in a very different phase in your life. You have colleagues, you have a career, you have people you work with who depend upon you. You may have a place that you've lived in for years and years. You may have adult children who have their own views about how you live your life. And so when two people connect at that age, they are not free. They can't just say, great, let's hook up, let's connect, let's get an apartment together. I know several couples in New York who have apartments and neither one of them will give it up. They live 5 blocks apart, and she has her apartment, he has his apartment. I know one couple, he lives in Princeton, she lives outside Boston. Neither one of them will give up the house. So there are these sort of interferences, these obstacles that appear. But the most important one is the children. Because if you were to get divorced when your children were 6 and 8, the parents decide what happens to the children. They go back and forth every weekend, or they spend a 6 months with it in Tuscany, whatever it is, but the children do not decide. But once your children are of age, they decide what their response will be to your actions. And the dynamic has shifted because parents have control for a long time over their children's lives, and then suddenly they have no control. And it is shocking and terrifying to realize that once you become a parent at that stage in your life and their life. So I wanted to write about all those dynamics and the way they play a part in people's lives. So this is about two people who had known each other and had a relationship when they're in college. They were very close. They had a great relationship, but they broke up because they both went to different colleges, and there was a big misunderstanding that caused this breakup. They each marry. She divorced and her ex-husband died. He is still married to the person he had been married to the whole time. So this is about that kind of complication, how you deal with your relationship, your intimate emotional relationship, which is still at the center of your life. But your life now is a network. It's a nest it's made of many elements that contain you and support you and protect you. And you can't just ignore it. You can't just say, okay, we're both moving to Tasmania. That's where we'll live together, because you have too many connections holding you in place. So I'll do a little reading, and I'll start at the very beginning. I never thought I'd see you here, Sarah says. Then she adds, but I never thought I'd see you anywhere. They're at the Opera House on the second floor, near the head of the grand staircase. He's facing her, leaning his hips against the railing, hands set lightly on either side. Beyond him, in the high open space of the atrium, hang the glittering crystal chandeliers, frozen starbursts. Below, people move up and down the broad red-carpeted staircase, hurrying but stately. They are mostly over 50. This is the second intermission, and there is only so much time left to meet someone, eat something, drink something before the caped ushers begin playing their little xylophones, the bright, tuneless melodies announcing the last act. She had known him at once. His younger face is still visible within this older one, though this one is creased now, hollowed here, fuller there. The same square shape, same bright brown eyes and wide brow, the same thick, light brown hair, though now not so thick. The same fierce vitality in the gaze. I always thought I'd see you somewhere, he says. He looks directly into her eyes. He had always done this, looked straight into her, as though she were important. It had always unnerved her. You look just the same. She smiles, but shakes her head. You know what I mean, he says. You do. Your eyes. They had been close at one time. After the last curtain call, the dark-haired soprano, curtsying deeply and charmingly, kissing her fingertips to the audience as plastic-wrapped bouquets thud onto the stage. Before the swirling gold curtain is finally drawn for good, Sarah stands, putting on her jacket. She buttons it as she inches her way across the row of seats to join the slow scrum in the aisle. She glances around for Warren, although he told her he was on the other side of the house. Almost as soon as they'd met, the little xylophones had begun their atonal melodies, and they'd had to part. He'd asked her to come out for a drink afterward, but she'd said no. She'd said it would be too late. Actually, it had been too sudden. She couldn't decide in that moment if she wanted to sit across from him again, letting him look into her. He asked for her email address, but he hadn't written it down. She thinks he'll forget it. It's so easy to forget those addresses. which seem in the moment so obvious, so unforgettable. Clara 38 at whatever. But they're also obvious in all their other iterations too. Was it Clara 39 at somewhere else, or Clara B 38? Hers is simple and obvious. She thinks he'll forget it. Now I'm skipping a little. He had not forgotten her address. His first message is short. I was glad to see you. She doesn't answer at once. It's the tone that concerns her. He's married, she knows that. What does she want? But she was glad to see him. She's allowed to be a friend. Finally, she writes back, yes, me too. He writes again. He's coming to New York on business next month. Will she meet him for dinner? She thinks about it. The speed of email telescopes time so that thinking about it for a few hours seems like days. Coming into the city for dinner is complicated for her. She lives in northern Westchester, over an hour away. It really means spending the night. She doesn't like driving home late, alone, her head fumed with wine. But she has a friend with a spare bedroom who always offers it. She writes back, yes. They meet at the restaurant, a fancy one on the west side. Along the street are big plate glass windows. As Sarah walks along the sidewalk, her little suitcase trundling behind her, she sees him inside. He's at a table in the middle of the room, very upright. His elbows are set elegantly on the table, his hands clasped. He's watching the door. As she comes in, he smiles at her, spreading open both hands in celebration. The restaurant is modern and expensive. The latter is evident from the heightened awareness of everyone in the room, the slightly hostile deference of the head waiter, the attentive, slightly condescending waiters, the sharp, sidelong glances of the diners, the glitter of earrings and bracelets. Along the inner wall, more plate glass windows give onto the kitchen, where chefs in white coats move swiftly, chopping and stirring and slicing, among white tile and stainless steel, pots and knives, steam and flame. The kitchen is like a silent movie, the workers framed, frenetic, soundless. Warren stands to greet her, smiling. Thank you, she says, sliding onto the banquette. When he sits down, their faces are close, and he looks directly into her eyes. Unsettled, she speaks to break the silence. I don't think men stand up for women anymore, she says. Do they? When we were kids, my father would say to my brother, stand up when your mother comes into the room. Do you remember? No one does that now. The culture of our youth, he says, gone. Good riddance, most of it, she says. All those rules. It's good to see you, he says. 30 years, anyway. Nearly 40. I'm skipping a little bit into this, but it's the same dinner. The waitress brings them little pots of foam topped with a dark slice of something, with the compliments of the chef. The waitress is stocky and authoritative. Her hair is pulled back in a complicated French braid. She wears a charcoal gray jacket and speaks confidentially, describing what they're about to eat. It's a mousse made from too many ingredients. Wonderful, says Warren. Give him our thanks. They're in a row of banquettes bisecting the room. Sarah takes a spoonful of the foam. It leaves a high tide mark along her upper lip. Briny, she licks it off. Did you end up going around the world? Not then, he says, and never all at one go, but I travel a lot. I'm on the board of the MFA. We go on a lot of trips. But she doesn't want to hear about the marriage. So I'm going to end that right there. Oh, no, I'm skipping a little bit. So he says, did you get a degree in art history? I remember that's what you wanted to do. I got married, she said. Rob didn't want me to go to graduate school. He nods, taking that in. What then? Had children, she says. After the kids were gone, I did go back and get a degree. He nods and says, what about your family? What kids do you have? 2, she says, a son and a daughter. I have only a daughter, he says. How old? Katrina's 24. Yours? Meg, 36, and Josh, 30. They smile at each other. It's funny, she says, when we knew each other before, we were just ourselves. Before you have any kids, the idea of them is so peripheral. Then it was just something to worry about. Getting pregnant had nothing to do with children. It had to do with us. Even when I got married, I put it off having kids. And now they're central, he says. I can't imagine things without them. But before you have them, you have no idea what it means, she says. The way they add to you as a person, how you become yourself plus a child. You can never become a single person again. You're always that thing, that joined thing, the parent of the child. There's no divorce from children, says Warren. No, says Sarah. It's for life. So that's, so it's for life. And they take over your life eventually. Their lives supersede yours because for a long time you think they're yours. I mean, when they're small, you think you own them. You think they'll do what you want. You think they partly are you because they once were yours. They were inside you. Then they were helpless. They actually were your creatures. And then it turned out, says Warren, they were not your creatures. They both laugh because they had never thought they were owned by their parents. They had always known that they had owned themselves. So I will read one more short passage because of what Sigrid said and about her dog and her cat and her parrot. And when my sister lived in Peterborough, just down the road from here, and she got to know Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who wrote that great book, The Secret Life of Dogs. And so my sister Kathy said to Thomas, oh, my sister's a writer. And Thomas said, and she said, and she loves dogs. And Thomas said, does she write about them? And my sister said, actually, no, she never does. And Thomas said, well, ask her why she doesn't write about them. So my sister asked me, and I said, because I respect dogs too much to ever make them a minor character, which Sigrid did not do. But I thought about it, and I thought dogs are a big part of my life. And so in my next book, I thought I would put a dog in who was a real character. So this is a dog named Bella. And she is a standard poodle, which is only mentioned once very late in the book. You're supposed to figure it out before that. So this is a description of Bella. At the end of the driveway, the dog is standing by the house. Sarah wonders what Bella does when she's alone. She doesn't like thinking of the dog without her. Bella is always waiting when she arrives. Today she wags her tail quietly, pleased but restrained. Sarah understands that this restraint is reproof. Sarah crouches and whispers her name. Bella tilts her head towards Sarah. She closes her eyes. She goes upstairs and Bella follows, nodding on each step, making a soft 4-beat rhythm with her padding footsteps. Sarah unpacks. Bella lies down, head raised, watching her. Beautiful girl, Sarah whispers. Beautiful girl. Bella has a large vocabulary. She knows all the obvious words: walk, dinner, vet, no, good dog, bad dog, although Bella is almost never bad, and when she is, it's deliberate. If Sarah is gone for too long, a week or more, Bella destroys something. It's always something of her own. When Sarah came home from England, the zipper on Bella's dog bed had been chewed through. Once when she was staying with friends, they'd gone to the grocery store where Bella wasn't allowed. Sarah tied Bella's leash to the fence beside the store. When Sarah came out, Bella was sitting by the fence, very still, her eyes on Sarah. A piece of the leash hung straight down from her collar. The other end was still tied around the fence. She had chewed it through, though she hadn't moved. It was a rebuke. Bella's mission is to align herself with Sarah, to become neurally connected. She studies Sarah, watching for signs of intention. She knows all the commands: sit, lie down, shake hands, roll over. She despises them. They are beneath her. If commanded to sit, Bella will lower her haunches to where they graze the ground, then lift them immediately and stand as though she had never sat down in her life. If asked to shake hands, she'll raise her paw impatiently, bat twice at the air, and then set it down. At the command to roll over, she will throw herself to the ground and roll over in one swift motion like a dolphin, then leap to her feet, eyes flashing, insane with contempt and impatience. She does all these things quickly, her manner perfunctory and condescending, like a math genius asked to do short division at a party. She finds tricks pointless, embarrassing to all concerned.
All right, so we're going to take some questions.
Is this
I'm
on?
not- Yeah, it is. I'm not quite sure how we're going to make that work for both of you, but is
you take
there
this
a question to start us off? Okay, we can just pass this back and forth because we got a long. All right, I see your hand. Go ahead.
I have a question for you. I noticed, I was struck by all your characters and your examples of people's phases of their life. They were all very. Do you ever write about working class people who don't have so much privilege? They go to college and they have a career and they play tennis and everything.
So I think a lot of people write about the things they know the best. And when I wrote Sparta, which is about a Marine lieutenant coming home from Iraq, I talked to as many Marines as I could find and as many veterans who would talk to me. And there are a lot of, the South has a much more military culture than the North. So it would have made sense to make my character come from the South. And there are a lot of people who went into the military in order to improve their economic conditions. So it would have made sense for me to write about somebody like that. But there are so many things I would get wrong if I wrote about somebody who came from a completely different background from me. And it always felt uncomfortable, as though I would be appropriating their stories. Why would I let you into my kitchen? I would get the food wrong. I would get the jokes wrong. I would get the clothes wrong. So it's not that I don't want to write about any other group of people, but it's because I believe that all humans have the same important stories to talk about, that everybody's life is important, that everyone goes through pain and joy and connection and grief. It happens to everyone at every level. And I had one student who told me he couldn't get into Anna Karenina because it was about rich 19th century Russians, which is just a really unconstructive way to look at that book. And if you start saying, I only want to read about one kind of person from one kind of background, you're limiting your own chance to experience life as a great writer like Tolstoy can show it to us. So it's not that I only want to write about a little narrow group of people, but most people write about the people who are closest to them, the circle that they know the best, because that's where all your pain comes from. That's where all your most vivid feelings come from your own family. So that is really a great source for most writers.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is for Ms. Nunez. In your book about Saigon, Vietnam, you did a very good job of getting the feel of Saigon, and I'm just wondering, were you ever there?
The book that you're referring to is called For Rowena. And the main character there is a woman who served in Vietnam as a U.S. Army nurse. That was Rowena. I have never been to Vietnam. No, at all.
Good job.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Roxana, I'm a bit of a late bloomer. I have just found you as a writer, and I look forward to reading more. I was.
Could you? They can't hear you. Could you speak up a little bit? Or
Come up and I'll try to speak up. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes. I just finished Cost. It wasn't, you didn't mention it.
No, I forgot.
And I was completely having, as a younger woman, a brother who was 1 year older than me. So he was in his 19, 20, 21, and I was 18, 17, 18, 19, who fell into that awful addiction. And your capacity to, kind of describe how the family just becomes wrapped around that, and the relationships that I forget the mother's name, that she has with her own parents. I wondered for you, how did you know it so well? And it was a beautiful book.
Thank you. So the question is, I wrote a book which I forgot to mention called Cost, which turned out to be about opioid addiction and Alzheimer's. And that, as you heard from Sigrid, the way books start can be from many sources. And that book, my intention when I wrote that, it was going to be a very short book, and it was going to be about 3 generations in an old summer house in Maine. And I was just interested in the way, at certain phases in your life, your relationship to your parents changes. And this was about a divorced woman, an artist, who has 2 sons in their 20s, and her parents are in their, I forget, late 70s, early 80s, and her father was a neurosurgeon. And he's losing his capacity to use his hands, and her mother is experiencing memory loss. So I was really interested in the way you respond as an adult child to your parents, and that I was interested in the fact that no matter how old you are, when you're with your parents, you can open your mouth and hear a whiny 6-year-old speaking, or a very condescending 21-year-old, and you can't seem to shake that. You can't seem to become your parents' equal, no matter how old you are. So I wanted to explore that. And it was just going to be this very short novel about the 3 generations, and it was told in their voices, and it starts out with the older parents, and then it goes into the mother's voice, and then it goes into the older brother's voice, and he's on the bus coming up to Maine, and he knows his mother is going to ask him about his younger brother if he's seen him, and he has. And so I'm in the older brother's mind as he is remembering his visit to his younger brother, who lives in Brooklyn, and I open the door into the apartment, and it's a mess. And I realized to my horror that his brother is a heroin addict. So that becomes the book. Then I spent 5 years going to meetings, talking to addicts, talking to doctors, talking to policemen, talking to interventionists, talking to the families of addicts to find out what that does physically and mentally and to the family. So it became a book about something much more powerful, and it turned out to be just before the opioid epidemic sort of hit the country. But that's an example of what happens when you start to write a novel. It just takes on forms that you don't expect. And that was a huge leap for me into another community. I mean, it was still people I could connect to, but the community of addicts is huge and very compelling. It's a very powerful and saddening place to live, but also heartening. I mean, there are people who make it through. So that was how I found my way into that story.
Other questions? Yep, Colin?
What is the mechanism that made your novels turn into screenplays and films?
What happened was that with The Friend, it had recently been published, and the directors, David Siegel and Scott McGee, they read a review, and that led them to the book, and they thought we could make a movie out of this, so they optioned it. And then there were a lot of obstacles because they finished writing the screenplay, and then there was the pandemic, and then, there were other obstacles, and then there was the Hollywood strikes and so on. So it's been a long process because it was just finished in 2024. But I chose, I chose not to be involved. I mean, I'm not a filmmaker, and I don't know anything about screenwriting or acting. So my idea was just to let them do whatever they were going to do. And I feel very lucky with both of these films. Then with the Almodovar, I had just come home from the movies. I'm a huge fan of his work, and I just come home one day from seeing Parallel Mothers. And there was this email saying that he was interested in, and at first I thought, well, how did they know I was at the movies? And now they're trying to scam me, of course. They're going to ask me to click on this link, and and he wanted, this is his first English language feature. And then when I thought about it, I thought, no, that makes sense, because these are, for the past several years, he's been, we're about the same age, and he's been really obsessed with mortality and loss for quite a while. And also he's one of his big subjects is women's friendship. So it really made sense to me. Anyway, again, while he was making this film, he would send some questions my way, but it was always understood that I was not going to participate in the writing of the screenplay or anything like that. And when it was showing at the New York Film Festival, which was its U.S. premiere, when he introduced it, and he said, and it was based on this book, and then he said, but I was not faithful to Sigrid. I was not faithful to her book. I was not faithful. So anyway, I was fully aware that with both of these films, it was not going to be a transcription, It was going to be an interpretation of some kind, And I knew things would be left out, changed, put in. But most writers I know are not happy they're disappointed with the adaptations of their work. So I feel very lucky, because in both cases, I've seen both films now more than once. I'm very happy. I understand all the reasons for the changes, and I'm very pleased with how they turned out. But I would never, sometimes writers decide they want to have some kind of control, and I just think it's a mistake. And also, the idea was, if you do go that route and you decide I want to have some control, then they're going to make a decision, and you're going to say, well, I actually think it would be better if, and then immediately, you've got this conflict, and I'm not really a good collaborator anyway. As I've said, there's a reason I've never been married. So my instinct was really correct to just not just to leave these people alone.
Can I ask you guys a follow-up question, maybe, which is how on the completion? Roxana, you listed some of the many books that you've written and talked about them, and on the completion of a novel, do you just leave it in? Can you describe what that's like? I think you talked about this unwitting trilogy. I don't imagine you have the same answer to that question. It's like when a book is done, it's done, and you're on to something else, or?
We all have our own experience, but I certainly, thanks.
Don't come here. Julie. Don't clap.
I miss that world after I've lost it, and it doesn't. it doesn't recur. I mean, people have said, will you write about these characters again? What happens afterwards? Somebody did ask me about two characters in the book at a reading, and I had never thought, she said, what happens to these two characters afterwards? And I had never thought about that. And I said, but I told her what happened. It came to me in that instant. I knew exactly what happened. But Liz Strout is writing about the same group of people, which is infinitely generative for her. And it's wonderful to encounter those same characters. It doesn't happen for me. I don't ever, those people are gone. I can't visit them again. We've severed our relationship, and then sadly, it's not because we had a fight, but they're gone to me. It's not a world I can enter again. And I never read a book after I've written it. I never read it once it's published, never. So, then you go on to the next one. Trollope, famously, who had a full-time job at the post office and wrote every morning at 5 and wrote over 80 books. He would write every morning, and he would write by hand, and he'd get to the end of a book, and he'd write the end at the bottom of the page, and he'd turn the page over and write chapter 1. So that's my model.
Well, in this trilogy, and that's part of what makes it a trilogy, I do have the same or close to the same narrator. But I also, I think I feel the same. When it's finished, I don't, it's finished. I've never thought about bringing a character from a book back who wasn't this particular narrator in this trilogy. And there is something, it's such a relief to leave it behind. It's somebody I know, a writer, compared it to the kids have grown up and gone off to college. The characters have gone they're out of the house, they're gone. And I don't want to reread them either, but I do have to do that to check translations, and that's always a very interesting and often very frustrating process. But that's when I do reread them. Otherwise, I would definitely avoid that too. I'm not sure what that is. Why that? I mean, it's like why we feel that way, that we don't want to revisit. But it's common. I mean, I know that Virginia Woolf also didn't reread her work. Yeah.
But Henry James, who changed his work every single time he saw it, and at the end of his life was arthritic and so couldn't write himself, and he had an amanuensis who wrote for him. But he would change it every time he saw it in front of him. And when he saw the galleys, he would change the galleys. And when the book came back published, he would change that. So I think that's something to avoid.
Yeah, I think actually one of the reasons why I don't want to look back at the work is because when you do, or when you're forced to, you find all these things that are wrong with it, and it's very discouraging, and it's too late to change. And and then again, there's the famous line that a book is finished when the editor takes it away from you. I mean, it could always be changed and improved and so on. So, yeah.
Okay, I see two. So you go first, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
This is a question about leaving. Without exposing any plot points, I was so taken aback and so upset by the way it ended. Did it upset you when it happened? When it came to you? Or did you know all along?
So some people feel the way you do. Some people say, oh, I could see it coming. One woman wrote to me on my website, she said, I'm completely baffled by the ending. Could you tell me why this happened? And I thought, 350 pages isn't enough to explain it? So, if I didn't explain it to you in the book, I feel as if I shouldn't try to explain it to you in person. But I do feel that you are given the pertinent information. It's hard to talk about it. It really is a spoiler. So I know I'm not blaming you. You're doing a perfect job. I just can't respond with any specificity without giving it away to everybody in the room. So
You knew
I did.
from the get-go.
I did. Because, I mean, one of the things about that the book is about the requirements of honor. And that was something that really interested me. And it's something that Edith Wharton wrote about. And it's something that opera is about. And the 19th century, which is the age of opera and the age of romanticism and the age of honor, is something that is not current today. We don't talk about it. We're in an age of irony. So honor is a sort of forbidden subject. It's beneath us all, because irony allows you to distance yourself from anything that is demanding in that way. But everyone, whether we talk about it or not, has a code, a moral code, whether they've written it down or articulated it. There's always something, you know where the red line is, the line that you would never cross as a person, because you are a better person than that. So everyone has a moral code. It's never something we discuss. It's not public discourse, part of public discourse. But I wanted to write about the challenges that honor presents. And if you have a code of honor, what would it take for you to call that into action?
Okay.
Yeah, my question has to do with the tone of your stories, which is wide open to both of you. Do your characters sometimes surprise you in changing the tone of how you thought the story was going to be going? Or is the tone set by how you yourself are feeling?
I wouldn't say that the characters change the tone, or I mean, what happens is, I remember one of the most important things that any teacher of mine ever said. I was trying to write my first book, or something, what turned into my first book, and I saw my teacher Elizabeth Hardwick, and I said, how do you write about your family, your parents? I mean, they're alive. They're you feel afraid, restrained, whatever. And she said, well, if you find the right tone, you can write about anything. Now, because she couldn't tell me how to find the right tone, but it's absolutely true. And I think you need to have that from the beginning. The book has a certain tone, it has a certain voice and style, and for me, nothing the characters would do would change that. I mean, if that did happen, that might actually signal being on the wrong road. What do you think?
That's interesting. Sigrid's voice is so powerful. She presents it with such force and such. It's so compelling. It's a really great way to talk about it. For me, the characters do often surprise me. They say things that like in Cost, I didn't think it was a book about heroin addiction at all. So that was a big surprise, but it doesn't change the tone, because the tone in which you are exploring this narrative, these characters, is something that you have set from the beginning. That's the way you are going to approach it. So that, like Sigrid, it doesn't change for me.
Okay, we need to wrap up. So please help me in thanking you.
Thank you.